friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on world history, which is the issues in world history 1, the 20th century. And in the earlier lecture on the economic recovery in the 1920s especially, we talked about that how kind of changes which came in the different economies of the world. And today we will talk about global depression in the framework of the world economic crisis which happened from 1929 onwards, and how there was an impact on the industrialized world and the semi-colonial world as well. So, we find that how these kinds of changes which came in the economy, especially after 1929 when we have the Wall Street crash in America, and how we find that its undercurrents, or rather its impact in that sense, could be seen in the various economies of the world. We find that in the earlier lecture we talked about the kind of boom which was there in Britain and the kind of slump which came in Britain, and how Britain was an important economy, one of the most important economies of Europe and the world at that point of time. And we find that after the First World War, there was a lot of change when we find that America became one of the most dominant economies of the world. And when we talk about the Great Depression, when we talk about the Wall Street crash, and how we find that in that sense the kind of reasons which have been given, the kind of speculation which was being done in the markets at that point of time, which led to the Wall Street crash. And we find that this kind of a crash, especially which not only affected America, but it also affected the other regions of the world. And we also have to see this kind of a situation in the kind of policies which were being followed at that point of time, and how the economies of the world they were operating at that point of time. And we also talked about last time in the framework of the gold standard, that how gold standard was being followed in Britain as well as it was being followed in America. Both of them, they had some kind of a reliance or some kind of a belief in the gold standard. And how this kind of a gold standard which was being followed by them, and how it also adversely affected both these economies. And how it gave some kind of a deflationary bias to the policies of the member countries in 1920s, and it was a source of opinion that the deflation was an antidote for the ills of the early 1930s. And we have to see how these kinds of conditions they were being created in the 1920s, and how these conditions they turned into the Great Depression. And we also see, when you talk about the kind of policies in different parts of the world, especially Germany, which was also worried about the foreign lending at that point of time and the reparations, because Germany had to pay a lot of reparations, especially after the First World War. We find that how Germany was in a way asked to pay in some kind of a reparation, how it was being held for the First World War, and the kind of guilt clause which was there. And apart from being accepting the responsibility of the war, we find that huge economic sanctions they were being also imposed on Germany. They were asked to pay the reparations in a phased manner. Apart from that, some of the regions of Germany they were also being given to the mandates, and how these mandates they were being given to the other countries of the world. So we find that US itself was worried about the speculation which was happening, and because of that we also see that how it produced some kind of a decline in the industrial production from 1928 in Germany, and in 1929 in US we find that there was some kind of a production which also was restricted. And we see that this kind of a situation which was there in the 1920s, as was seen by some of the economists of this particular time, that they were arguing that gold standard should not be there, especially Keynes, who was not in favor of continuing with the gold standard which was being followed in Britain and US as well. So we see that this kind of a situation it created some kind of an economic situation which led to and the economic crisis as well. And we find that this kind of a decline in production, especially as we were talking about 1928 onwards, it also continued in 1930s as well. And we find that this kind of a continuation of this kind of a decline or overall production, it created scare in Europe as well as America. And we find that the demand was also falling this time, and this kind of a fall in the demand was also not counteracted, especially in late 1920s. And we find, when you talk about the various policies which were being followed at that point of time, whether the fiscal policy or the monetary policy, we find that the authorities, they did not implement any expansionary policies at that point of time. And the following of the gold standard also communicated to them that expansion was bad, and unless the economies they are going to expand, we find that any kind of economic development is also not going to happen in that way, because the expansion of the economy was one of the important exercises where we find that if economies they have to rise, then economies they have to expand as well. So it was not being realized at that point of time, or even with realization, not concerted efforts they were not being made in that sense, where we find that the focus was on the expansion of the economy. And when you talk about especially America, we find that the Federal Reserve Bank, it did not engage in any open market purchases to offset the deflationary pressures which were there. And in Germany, this performance was bettered, and German railway company was forced to abandon its plan for large investments as a result of credit scarcity. So we find that expansion could not happen in Germany because there was shortage of funds. They were also engaged in terms of paying the reparations. How some of the regions of Germany which were providing them resources, they were also being taken away by the Allied powers or the victorious powers. So we find that the German situation was not healthy from the point of view of the economy. And we find that German bank, Reichsbank inability to finance a deficit further strengthened the deflationary impulses during this time. And Heinrich Brüning, who was the chancellor, he introduced a series of austerity measures, including in terms of increasing the taxes, reducing the benefits, and cutting prices and wages. But we find that all these kinds of measures which were being taken at that point of time were austerity measures. For example, that there will be less government spending, the government will not spend much, and some kind of a cutting on the government expenditure was being done. And we find that in terms of reducing the wages was another thing which was being taken up by Germany at that point of time. So we realize that all the nations of the world, they also in a way realized the economic situation and the kind of measures which they would undertake to handle the economic pressures in terms of deflation or the kind of depression which was being created at that point of time. So we find that other countries like Britain, for example, how although the public spending it rose during this particular period, but it was only a 5% rise in the real terms, and patently not enough to stop the depression as it took place. And even when the gold standard in 1931 was taken off, it was not being implemented. We find that how this kind of a situation also we find that how it in a way helped Britain achieve a milder depression, because Britain realized in that sense its mistake, and it did away with the gold standard in 1931. And we also see if you see the kind of monetary and the fiscal policies which were being followed at this point of time, where they were comparatively conservative in nature, and Britain continued with these kinds of fiscal and monetary policies. And we find that because of such kind of tactics or policies, we find that the expansion could not take place the way it could have been taken place if, apart from the gold standard, we find that they could have in a way changed their economic in their monetary as well as the fiscal policies. So that was one reason where we find that the growth of Britain to some extent got restricted. And we find that when you talk about the arguments which have been given for this kind of a behavior, was that the larger public expenditure would destroy the confidence in the crowd out private activity. So this kind of an argument was also being given, that if there will be more expenditure, then the public confidence in a way would be destroyed, and the private activity would also not take place. And when you talk about the economists like Keynes, he provided the solution of greater public expenditure to combat the fall in the aggregate demand, that when you will in a way spend more money on the public services or on the public expenditure would be greater, then we will find that there will be fall in the aggregate demand would be less. So pervasively lauded and used later was dismissed as lingering illusions on part of certain commentators at that point of time, though it was being used later as well. So we find that how the position which was being provided by Keynes during the Macmillan Committee hearing fell on absolutely deaf ears at that point of time. And we find that how people, they began to expect deflation to continue as well. So their expectation was that the prices would be even lower in future. So we find that this kind of an expectation of, in terms of deflation, where prices would be lower, was also one of the factors during this time, one of the situation which we encounter at this point of time. And this situation in a way gave rise to two effects. One was that the people hold back purchases to take advantage of expected lower prices, that now people, they were not purchasing because they expected that the prices will fall further down, and they are going to buy when the prices will be down further. Secondly, they are also reluctant to borrow at any money rate of interest because they would have to pay back effectively more than prices are lower and money rate of interest falls below real rate. That is, the money rate deflated by price level. So people, they were also in a way, were not in a way trying to borrow something, they were reluctant to borrow because they felt that they have to pay back effectively more when prices would be lower, because they had this kind of an expectation that prices are going to fall. And so we find that these two kind of situations they were being in a way expected by the people at that point of time, and this definitely happened, or certainly happened during depression. Although the lack of sensitive expectations indicators means that we cannot date a beginning of this kind of a phenomena which was in a way witnessed at that point of time. And we see by the spring of 1931, expectations had caught up with the events, and people began to expect more deflation and postpone the expenditure until deflation ended. So we find that by the spring of 1931, the situation they had caught up, in that sense that the expectations were more in the kind of events which were happening, and people, they were expecting that there would be more deflation now, and they felt that how they can in a way postpone their purchases, their expenditures until the end of the deflation. So such was the kind of activity which we find this time, that what all was happening, how people, they were reacting to the economic situation during that particular period, and how they had this kind of an expectation that when the prices will fall in future, then they are going to purchase, make their purchases. So this in a way further created a situation of depression, because we will find that the people, they were not interested in a way making, in terms of making purchases. So the money will not reach the markets if people are not going to buy, if they are not going to make their purchases. And we find that how deflation in a way increased the real burden of debt as well. They were further curtailing the expenditure, and the government response all through these times continued to be deflationary, barring the British world force, that how Britain made some kind of a change in 1931 by doing away with the gold standard. And we also see that at the world level, how the national policies of different countries, they were also interacting, and how many of the individual reactions they also in a way produce depression as well. And many of the specific events which were happening in different parts of the world, they were also contributing to the general trend. And how the First World War especially had changed the world economy, how USA had come to the forefront, when we find that before that how Britain or British economy was at the forefront, but now USA was a major economy. And we find that the people, those who were the supporters of the gold standard, they did not pay attention to this, and they were trying to in a way force their outdated system on the world, and it also led to the Great Depression. And we find that in a way, when we try to compare the situations, the people or the physicians who treated Mozart with mercury to cure his ailments, they not only failed to cure disease, but they also killed the patient as well. So how the economy was being crushed because of such kind of tactics or such kind of policies which were being followed at this point of time. And when one sees the kind of effects, when we talk about the kind of impact it created, we find that statistics, they are an important indicator. They try to communicate a number of figures, and many times, but statistics are not able to reveal the true picture because the way people they suffered are beyond the kind of statistics which are being given. And so in that way we find that many times the kind of explanation which is being given beyond the statistics, they are able to communicate the situation. And we find that how the kind of downturn in the Great Depression was so catastrophic that the figures, they in a way speak eloquently in this era. And we in a way can talk about this kind of a table where we see the kind of changes which were there from 1929 to 1937, and how when you see 1929 as a base of keeping 100, and how kind of changes which came in 1937, whether you take the case of foodstuffs, you take the case of raw materials or manufacturers, all of them they, as you can see in the table as well, all of them in 1937 are in a way have reduced. So we find that in various economic activities, whether they related to the world trade, world production, or that matter we find the raw materials, how the manufacturers, world trade, world production, we find that there is a lot of decline during this particular period. And this kind of a decline can only be attributed to the world economic crisis, because the kind of a situation which got changed from 1929 onwards, it brought the world economy on its heels that way. And how so many countries of the world, apart from the developed world, we also find that the third world, which was already suffering under the rule of the colonial rulers, they also got affected in the various regions of the world. So we find that how the world economic crisis was some kind of a bane to the world economies at that point of time, and the world economies were not able to in a way withstand the kind of pressures which were being generated during this point of time. So when we tend to understand the kind of data which has been given to us, and how this data is being interpreted by the economists and the scholars, we find that all of them, they point out that it was not to the advantage of the economy. During 1937 we find that all sorts of decline, as the table also suggests, took place during this particular period. So, when one is talking about the economic depression, when one is talking about the world economic crisis, one has to also in a way realize that it had, apart from the economic ramifications, it had other ramifications as well. When we tend to see it in the framework of the shifting of the balance of power as well, we find that how various economies of the world they got affected during this time, and how Russia during this particular point of time was not affected, and there is a lot of debate with regard to that. We find that how Russia insulated itself from the impact of the other economies during this time. And Russia was one country where we find that Russia was not in a way affected by the Great Depression or the kind of changes which came during this time. And we also find that most of the debtor countries, they were the primary producers as well, and how this decreased the ability to import the manufacture. And however, when you talk about that how when we see the trade contracted more than the production, it was because of the erection of the various trade barriers as well, the kind of restrictions which were being imposed by the various countries on trade during this time. It was one of the important factors. How they increased the tariff was an important indicator when you talk about that how various countries of the world, they wanted to in a way restrict they wanted to in a way safeguard their own space for trade, and because of which we find that they raised various kinds of tariffs in terms of imports, and they wanted their exports to rise, but at the same time they did not want that their imports should be higher. So, in that sense we find that when tariffs they were being imposed on the imports, then there would be lesser imports. So, this kind of a situation was also not conducive for the trade as well. And as we talked about that how USSR was one country which was in a way insulated from the world economy at that point of time, and the other Asian economies like Japan, they are tight slump with the expansionary policies which were followed only mutedly if at all in Britain, and completely cold shouldered in US and Germany. And we also talk about that how unemployment in the various industries at this point of time, it also increased, that people, because when there was a decline in the production, then definitely we find that unemployment rate in the various economies of the world, it also increased. And when you talk about that how it was one of the important social consequences as well, because when people were unemployed, then the production and the productivity, it will also be affected, as well as the standard of living and the consumption patterns, they will also see a lot of change. So, we find that how unemployment was an important indicator during this time, and how not only in US, but in France and Germany we find that there was a sharp rise in the unemployment figures. And when you compare it with Britain, then we find that when you talk about Britain, we realize that when you compare it with US and Germany, we find that unemployment figures in Britain, they were comparatively better when you see the situation. And when you see that how British economy, there was also decline in 1929 and thereafter, and other economies of the world, especially only USSR, was showing some kind of an upswing during this time. And this kind of a situation also created some kind of a slump as well. And when you talk about Britain especially, we find that especially the wholesale price index which were there in 1932, and we find if you see the figures as well, if you see the index, when you compare the different countries, and if you keep it at the level of 1929 as 100, then USA, Germany, France and UK, all of them they are showing an index of 67.5, 70, 65 or 75. So, these kind of indices which are being shown in 1932, and we find that deflation was pervasive and substantial during this time. So, we will talk about depression and its other manifestations in our next lecture. Thank you very much.